Welcome to CISO Interviews, where Affinia hosts cybersecurity executives sharing career advice, actionable insights, and tips so that you can enhance your career and succeed as well.
Kevin, so awesome to have you today. As we begin, can you say a few words about what are you up to now? What's your current role?
Yeah, thanks, Misha. So I work at a company called Dido. We're a Google Premier partner, and I helped found and lead our cybersecurity division. And we basically, the quick elevator pitch is we migrate, manage, and secure the cloud. So I do a lot of cybersecurity, a lot of things like authorizations to operate, and just helping companies deal with very high-end security. Right now, I'm doing a lot of security work for some of the highest end security companies in the world. So doing cybersecurity for cybersecurity companies is my biggest role. Teaching a lot, doing a lot with Duet AI, which is Google's generative AI product. Some really cool stuff there, but I can dive into it deeper than that, but that's kind of the
Awesome.
20,000 feet overview.
Great. Didn't they just rebrand it to Gemini or something from Bard?
So it's a little confusing. Bard is the consumer level product. Duet AI is the commercial product. And yes, they just renamed to Gemini, which will become very confusing as well, because Gemini is also the name of their multimodal AI engine, which is one of like 1,200 AI engines that you can bring into from what's called the model garden as part of tools like Vertex AI. So yes, they renamed it, but it'll be more confusing because that's like Gmail versus Workspace. Gmail is the free personal use product, and then the Workspace is the commercial offering. So Bard and Gemini and Google One are all consumer offerings. Whereas Duet AI and Vertex and things like that are part of add-ons to Workspace or Google Cloud Platform.
Got it. It's just that I saw the news. They had just the headline that ChatGPT passed 2 billion or something in revenue. So totally blew me away. So
Yeah.
Google, I think Google in the end will give them their run for the money, because as far as models are concerned, Google has decades of data. It will be very interesting to see that battle between the two down the line.
Yeah, have you heard the quote, the data's the new oil? Have you ever heard that before?
I did.
Yeah. So, and I think that's totally true. And that's why you're going to see like Microsoft's partnership with OpenAI for ChatGPT is instrumental, as well as all the data that Google's built up for decades. Things like Google Search, but Google Scholar, all of the data that you, when you use free Gmail, that you allow them to use in an aggregate manner, just goes into those large language models. And, large language models aren't particularly as new. I mean, I think it's taking the world by storm, and OpenAI deserves massive credit for that breakthrough last year, where people proved that they were willing to use these products. But for example, Google Translate, which many people have been using for, let's say over a decade, uses and is built on large language models. So this isn't as new. In fact, I probably have ranted about it before, but for example, the gentleman that I consider the father of AI is a mathematician cleric named Thomas Bayes or Bayes. His book was published posthumously in 1753. So machine learning, AI, certain concepts and whatnot.
Yeah,
we're coming to a critical point with them, but.
Well, it's interesting like how things come into play, and certain things, as far as technology is concerned, there are so many iterations and so many kind of trial and error along the way before it really takes off. So a lot of different pieces need to come into play. I mean, before iPhone, not to get us on that tangent, I really want to learn more about your story. I don't know if you remember, there was Newton. Remember this little device, and before that there was, I don't even remember what it's called, Palm Pilot. So there's so many iterations that kind of took off a little bit, but it was so clunky and so slow that it really took a lot of different pieces to come into place for the iPhone to really be compelling to take off. So certainly what we see as new is there's a long kind of backstory to that. And speaking of that, how did you get into cybersecurity space? I know you have interesting experiences along the way.
This episode is brought to you by Afinia, a community where 2,000 CISOs and other senior executives network, learn, and succeed together. To apply for your complimentary membership, please visit www.afinia.com or click the link in the show notes. Now, back to the show.
Well, I'm a graybeard with this. I've been doing cybersecurity since really it was called cybersecurity, so over 30 years. But it is interesting because I started doing work with what became the Apache SpamAssassin project. It was an older script called PLX at that time in the mid 90s, like around the 97 era, 96. And in 1996, I was running an ISP and we had no spam on Thanksgiving Day. And what was very interesting about that was that Thanksgiving Day is just a normal Thursday to everywhere else in the world except the US. So it's a normal business day. And so why did all the spam that we typically see from Russia and China and Brazil, even back then, go to zero? And that started us thinking about things like puppet masters and who was pulling the strings, who was sending the spam, perhaps using systems in other countries, but perhaps being US based. Myself and another gentleman, Rick Howard, who at the time was the chief security officer over at Palo Alto Networks, when we talked about it, we collapsed later on. We're not really good at naming things on our threat data, but for example, we would come up with company one, company two, and at one point in time, about 15 years ago, we collapsed company 107 through company 1 down to only 7 companies. And that started this concept that there really aren't a whole lot of players in the space. There's people that do onesie twosie, but as far as the big engines, the big people selling platforms for cybersecurity defense and whatnot, it came from that. But the real question of how I got into cybersecurity came from protecting my own ISP and getting rid of spam. And then that question in 96 or 97, I'd have to go back and look, of why did all of the spam go to zero on Thanksgiving Day in the US? And the rest of it is trying to answer that question.
So just double click. So when you collapse, the 7 players are the organizations that send spam at scale.
Yeah, or provide, that we're using similar engines, similar technology. We have a term for it. We call it ratware. That's software that sends spam. But, what was the technique they were using? And, especially back then, for example, you hadn't quite got this dark web market where they were selling services to do these things. So we started pulling some threads and realizing that, this server in Russia and this server in Brazil were running the exact same software and had the same people, coordinating them, maybe a command and control type of solution. But yeah, exactly. So went from, over 100 and collapsed it down to 7. And so I think, putting some words in Rick's mouth from speeches he's given in the past, as well as myself, I think we both think that, in the sphere of major bad actors, there's only about 100 or less.
But that changes over time. They kind of retire, they go on vacation somewhere and get nabbed and extradited and spend some time in jail. They get taken
I'm not as
competitors. But
I'm very negative on that whole thing. That's somebody who pissed off somebody in the wrong nation state government, and they threw them as a gift to whatnot. So when you see those arrests and stuff like that, or 4 people from Russia or 7 from China that get arrested, I'm like, I wonder who they made mad in their country, and they decided to ship them off to the US.
It's just someone thrown under the bus for, it's not poor OPSEC. It's really more infighting and internal politics.
I don't know. One of the classes I teach is called Think Evil, and I certainly don't think it's as transparent as, somebody was that dumb to go to a country and got extradited. So
interesting. It's such a fascinating topic and such fascinating space, and it changes so fast. I know a decade ago, when people thought, well, hackers, the image you would get conjured in your mind is this teenager that up to no good in a hoodie hunched over a computer, doing something either mischievous or evil. And now we're talking about state-run, sponsored, and resourced organizations So really kind of enterprise scale effort with vacation policies and pension plans and healthcare and delegation of duties. It's just staggering how the world of defenders and the world of attackers evolved over time. Like, what do you see now? I mean, it's obviously you've spent a lot of time and given a lot of thought. Where do you see this going? Is it just in terms of complexity, in terms of um, just the resources that go? At the end of the day, kind of evil, to your point, kind of pays, right? So as long as it does, the resources will continue to go there. But is it just never-ending struggle between, it's a tank and a missile? Like the tank, gets stronger, then the missile gets stronger, then the tank gets stronger. So is it kind of never-ending battle that the attackers and defenders will continue to try to get one up on each other?
Yeah, I think that's exactly. It's a cat and mouse game. It's the cops and robbers. The robbers will come up with a new technique, and the cops have to figure out how to stop them. So, but I think some of the story that you talk about with the hackers and the hoodies is almost too far forward in history. One of the things that I like to bring up, especially with the younger audiences, is that hackers really started out of a concept of largely stealing telephone services. It was called phreaking with a PH, so PH and then phreaking, and that was a play on the word phone. And that started really in the 60s and whatnot, where they would use technology to talk to the back end of the phone systems and make free phone calls. And for the most part, it was very almost like, academics gone a little bit crazy. It wasn't hackers weren't as negative as they've evolved to. And I think, like for example, I'm sure you'll ask me some questions about it, but I've been raided by the FBI. I've had some fun stories there and whatnot. But when the FBI did that raid in the 90s, they were looking for money. They were looking for an organizational hierarchy. They threatened myself and other people involved in basically pirate bulletin board software with RICO, which is racketeering, designed to stop the mafia. And what's very interesting is at the time, I completely thought the FBI was just, crazy because, we were a bunch of hackers that for the most part, no money was involved. If we hacked into a major system, we might leave a note that said, ha ha, we were here kind of thing. But there wasn't this maliciousness of, crypto and ransomware and millions of dollars and things like that. But the FBI was totally right that it was evolving to that standpoint, and that it was very shortly after that that you started to see these underground organized criminal activities. So like especially when I'm talking about hackers and almost anything probably pre-2000, I would equate it to today's ecosystem of makers. If people are familiar with Maker and Maker Faire and things like that, it's about taking electronics or taking apart a printer and taking the motor out of it and doing something weird with it. A lot of recycling and doing things that it wasn't intended to do, sometimes with no documentation and things like that, no real idea of what you might be able to do with it. That was really what the hacking was like. Hey, we've got this piece of equipment. We have no instructions for it. What can we make it do? And so it was like, that's why I talk about it being more academics. And, sometimes there was definitely some malicious stuff. There was, the free phone calls and stuff, but I don't think there was this interest in finances and harm that has become prevalent today. And the biggest problem with that prevalence is, the scale of economies. Some of the countries where they can steal this money, things like Korea, North Korea, are under sanctions. So if they can steal money out of the US, it's not a crime to them internally. They're rock stars in their countries.
For sure. I mean, it's just staggering. I see a lot of crypto scams and hacks of infrastructure, whether it's crypto exchanges or whatnot. They originate in North Korea, and it seems like that's how they're paying for a lot of things that they cannot get otherwise, but also more on the, I guess, consumer end of it. I see reports in Myanmar of centers with people against their will in front of computers that get from invited for a job, really, but then they're held there against the will, and they're involved in all sorts of scams, sending emails. I mean, they call it pig butchering when they essentially, it's a confidence game, but it's at scale, like literally call centers and with hundreds of people run by whether I guess you can't really say, but a lot of them are Chinese nationals or people from Southeast Asia. But just the scale and the scope of it is pretty incredible. You mentioned, well, and so kind of on air, because what you mentioned, I think it's very interesting. It seems like back in the day, to your point, hacking was more an act of rebellion in a way, and quote unquote revenge in the system, but it was never an intent to do substantial harm or get substantial financial gain. I mean, placing a call to a girlfriend overseas and getting away with making it for free is certainly against the rules, but it's not equivalent of bringing down an electrical grid of a city or jeopardizing energy infrastructure of a country. So just the scale and the scope and the intent are completely different. So that kind of shifted. But I think going back to your point, that ethos, I think, is more prevalent now in someone who's doing like pen testing or a bounty hunter who is tinkering, figuring things out, figuring what's broken, what's missing. But again, not with an intent to cause harm, but with an intent to leave a note, hey, this is broken, you need to fix it. And and to me, it's surprising sometimes organizations take their sweet time in fixing databases that have without a password somewhere in the cloud. Months go by, it's still unattended.
Yeah.
So
That's definitely frustrating for me. I come across, exploitable systems or particular problems, and a scary amount of my time is often wasted on trying to convince the people that, it's valid, that they can do a reference check, that they can call us at a real phone number, et cetera, to tell them they have a problem, just to convince them they have an issue. In fact, one of my favorite stories about that, I was in a big box store. People, could go in and, make copies and send faxes and things like this. And the gentleman in front of me was trying to send a fax, and the worker behind the counter was trying to get it to work, wasn't working. And, he asked the gentleman to read it off the phone number, and he reads it off. And, I'm like paying attention a little bit, kind of like in the side of my brain, not really, like really paying attention. I was waiting in line to ship my package. And finally, like, the guy's having this problem, and I listened more carefully, and I'm like, oh, that's a German cell phone. That's not a US number. Like, I knew the prefix for Germany's cell phones, and I was like, you're trying to send an international number. And so the worker comes over, he's looking at the form with the gentleman in front of me, and I'm looking over his shoulder and looking at the form, like, yeah, see this here, this is an international number. And the guy goes, oh, yeah. And, I'm teaching the person at the store, like, you got to probably dial something like 001 or 011 or something like that to get an outside international line. Then you've got to dial the international prefix and everything to get the code. And I said, but I'm looking at this form, and I said, this is a scam. This is a form to get this person to pay a certain amount of money to pay for duties and customs on a scam. I don't know if you know that particular type of scam, but they will basically try and say that sorry, a lot of construction noise in the background. That's probably for you to filter out. But the scam involves, like, they say, hey, you've got a package waiting for you, but you have to pay whatever, $15, $100, $1,000 in fees so that it could be released to you. And then once you pay it, of course, there is no package, et cetera. There is no prize. There is no whatever the next step that they've promised you that's going to occur. And so I explained this to the gentleman, that the fax he's trying to send is actually a scam, that it's international. That's why he can't get the store to send the fax. The worker who's there at the store looks at it and goes, oh my gosh, you're totally right. I'm so glad I wasn't able to send this fax. And to give you an idea of when I talk about the trouble you sometimes have telling people about the problem, The gentleman then proceeded to grab the fax out of the worker's hand and speak extraordinarily loudly and slam the door on his way out, saying, "If you guys won't fax it for me, I'll find a place that will." You know,
Interesting.
so, and I think a lot of people don't recognize that, but it's extraordinarily difficult sometimes to tell them. But yeah, when you're dealing with pen tests, you know, like for example, one of the things that's also that I teach about a lot is if you are publicly disclosing a hack of any type, it is almost always unethical. And you know, that's something that a lot of people that are in the cybersecurity field fail to do correctly. You know, they're looking for the fame, the fortune, the sirens call of the media gets to them, and they want to be angry that XYZ company hasn't fixed a hack or whatever, so they're going to go public with it as a way to leverage the company theoretically into doing it. And extraordinarily difficult to ever do that ethically. The only times that you know, I really even talk about it being possibly ethical is when there's harm occurring, risk to life, certain scenarios, but we look very carefully about what are the
Well, you
pros
want to
and cons
give
of that.
the right of first refusal for uh, the guardians of the gate to close the gate first before telling everyone it's open.
Right, but how long do you have to give them that right for? Is it a week, 3 months, 9 months, 2
It's a
years?
judgment call, but I think your rule
Yeah,
of thumb, whether people's lives are at risk or
yeah.
financial ruin, is
I mean, we have to sit down
one.
and just think about it
Yeah,
ethically and debate it. Like, is there a benefit in going public with this? But I see the vast majority of public disclosures are not done ethically.
absolutely. And I guess one thing I should want to double click, you mentioned, since we're in the hackers topic, and on how, well, sometimes kids, they get into gaming, they uh, get fascinated by computers and start figuring out ways to make some money. And there's a kind of very fine line of what's uh, the path of good and the path of evil. And sometimes, especially at a younger age, not even like older age, it's not always easy to decide where this line lies. What would be your advice for someone who's starting in cybersecurity, maybe fancying a career as a pen tester? What will be your advice for how to find that line and how to push the boundaries, but do it in a way as to not to jeopardize one's career down the line?
You know, I think the key thing is to have a compass. You know, ethics is probably the right way to put it. There's a wonderful organization called USENIX, USENIX, back, I don't know, 25 years ago or so. They had an organization underneath USENIX called the System Administrators Guild, or SAGE, and that morphed into the large installation system administrators, which was
Mhm.
LISA, and then they brought it under USENIX. So if you search for USENIX Code of Ethics, there is an absolutely wonderful, I call it the IT 10 Commandments, but I think there's about 12 of them there. That has served me very well over the last few decades, especially when things are gray area and there isn't clear laws, there isn't clear guidance on whether you should do. And we go down through those steps there and use it as a litmus test one by one to see how we do things. The biggest thing probably with people that are doing this is, you know, that are looking to get into cybersecurity is I would probably tell them not to start with pen testing. Pen testing is a type of cyber that we call offensive cyber. It's known as red teaming. They should focus on defensive cyber, blue teaming. It's very difficult to get in trouble doing blue teaming. You know, whereas, for example, I've done legitimate work in things like critical infrastructure. We will, during that work, we will negotiate a rules of engagement for what we're allowed to do, what we're not allowed to do. And, you know, let's say, for example, it says that we are going to try and pen test 10 systems from Friday at 5 p.m. Eastern until Sunday at 8 p.m. Eastern. And that's our window. And, you know, Monday morning we wake up and go, oh crap, we only did 9 of the systems. We forgot the 10th. And we go do a penetration test of that. We could actually be committing a crime, even though we are white hat hackers. We're contracted by the company because we've now broken that rules of engagement that we have agreed to do for the work. And so, for example, if you're not aware of rules of engagement, if you haven't read terms and conditions, if you aren't aware of like what the limitations you're allowed to do are, you're probably very likely to run afoul. The other thing that I sometimes find there's a lot of people that are, I mean, I think they think they're being funny malicious, but for example, they'll post things publicly, Stack Overflow even, and other things. And somebody will say like, hey, I need to do this. How do I do it? And they'll give them some code that's very, very malicious, or they'll have them download a script. And it's like, okay, so you just downloaded a script randomly from a hacking site and ran it on a network because somebody told you that's what you needed to do, but you have no idea what the script does and you haven't read it and you don't understand what it even does. So I get quite a few problems of things like that. Kids that are, I call them kids, I'm sorry, the people that are new in the career and stuff like that, and they're reading and they just blindly run commands that are on a tutorial. And for example, one of the ones you can find a lot of times is people will like base 64 encode RM-RF. So you run the command and it deletes your entire hard drive from the root. Things like that. That's a simple one that's more malicious for that person's machine.
Yeah,
But you
or
can
even
see
something a script that installs now you backdoored your system and there's no way of extracting it, like, right? So congrats.
exactly. And some people do it for fun. Some people do it because that's a way to trick people, but don't get involved in offensive cyber unless you start to understand those ramifications. Get a good mentor who can guide you through it safely.
Or as you said, don't get involved as the first step. Just get an idea of other areas, and then if you're still leaning towards that, I mean, once you know which side is up, it doesn't have to be the first step.
Well, and the reality of the situation is the good pen testers are not in it for all the rock and roll drugs and women, that people see with it. The reality is that there's very small circles that we discuss the information in, rarely, if ever, discussing any of it publicly. Most people do not know what's going on behind the scenes. I mean, when I tell people, for example, that the threat data I publish protects hundreds of millions of users every single day and protects over 30% of the domains on the internet, they're like, really? I've never even heard of it, and things like that. And some people know it by my initials and things like that. But the reality is that most of us are just very, very quiet and behind the scenes and just looking to move that needle. And the reality is, like, for example, when I teach classes involving cyber, we actually have a dropout rate about 20% or more.
Why?
And that's, a lot of people are lured. They think cybersecurity is, if you will, sexy and high paid, and the reality is it's fairly soul crushing, and it's a lot of people fail to have good compensatory techniques to deal with it. But I mean, you figure, when I'm dealing with cybersecurity, you figure 24/7, 365, I'm dealing with the dregs of the internet, the dregs of the world, and never, it's not like it's a good day. It's just basically, how bad a day is it going to be? And pretty routinely my phone rings with somebody who's crying that has an existential threat to either their personal finances or their business, because of some issue that's occurred. And, it literally destroys lives, and, you've got to figure out how you're going to deal with that. So it's something that I tell people, and a lot of people just realize, they're like, I don't want this stress. It isn't something that I find interesting. And, I thought it would be like Mr. Robot, which is fabulous, by the way.
Do you like it, by the way?
Well, sometimes some of the stuff hits too close to home, but I think his name is Dave Kennedy. I don't have it prepared, but he owns a company, I think, called Trusted Sec, and he does all of the behind the scenes to make it so that it looks like real hacking and stuff like that. So he's the one that the stunt man behind the scenes that makes Rami look good in Mr. Robot. So the techniques they use are very real. And that history goes back, like, for example, War Games, now a pretty old film, but War
I
Games
tried to watch
is,
it. It's really it obviously with technology didn't age very well. It's
no,
Matthew Broderick, right?
yeah, Matthew Broderick. But the neat thing about it is, like, that technique of dialing an exchange and then randomizing the numbers, or not randomizing, going sequentially through the numbers. We actually used to call, before that movie, demon dialing. And after War Games came out, it was called war dialing, as an homage to the film. So that movie actually has real techniques and whatnot in it discussed. And, like, for example, with me, I don't discuss like spam techniques. I don't discuss red teaming techniques. I don't discuss hacking techniques unless I know I'm in a room, for example, with people that have something like a certified ethical hacking credentials or a similar thing from the DoD, or qualified ethical hacking and things like that, that are, basically making sure that they're not going to use this information for harm. Also from the standpoint that they can protect themselves, that they're not going to get tricked, as I was mentioning with some of those people that are new in the field and getting tricked on it.
Sure. Well, I'm getting tricked. I'm not sure if you saw the news, but I think in Hong Kong, one gentleman in financial
Yeah.
department wired $25 million because after a Zoom call with what he thought was his CFO or and other associates, but in reality, and again, it's alleged. I don't know all the details, but allegedly all this was AI generated, and I think it's the first I saw it publicized, and it's probably a sign of things to come, which kind of begs the question: with all the technology, with all the money and all the tools that are going into space, I mean, are humans still the weakest link? And would that still be subject to social engineering and all attacks that will trick the eye and push people to take actions that are not in their best interest or in the best interest of their organization?
Well, I think there's a lot to unpack there. I think that's a 4-hour lecture just from that one question. So, the thing, again, one of the classes I teach is called Think Evil. And so what we do is we put people in situations where they have to think about how technology could be used for bad. And so, for example, generative AI, which is the big thing with the deep fakes and everything that you're talking about, largely goes back to a white paper written in 2017 by a group of 4 people, maybe 5, who did a paper on how to create anime automated quickly. And they could do things like change the hair that's blonde on this guy to red, or change his suit from blue to black, things like that. And so that was the original concept behind it. That led to people pointing out some things. Like one of my favorite websites to point out some of the issues is a website called thispersondoesnotexist.com. And those are all computer, they're done with a thing called a GAN, a generative adversarial neural network, to create pictures that look like humans, but are not in any way, shape, or form real photos in any way, shape, or form. And yesterday, 2 days ago, somebody on Twitter posted that they were able to use an AI generator to create 2 fake IDs that met the know your customer banking rules. And so, but we've been talking about that as a risk since, the 2017 era. These type of technologies, it's sometimes a matter of time before they catch up. The deep fake one, just to let you know, absolutely, I do believe it's real. The details that are in the longer format about it seem very genuine. And in particular, what was terrifying about that was that it wasn't just a one-to-one meeting like you and me. It was a meeting where they set up deep fakes for an entire like corporate structure with a couple of people that he knew and recognized. And then they deep faked the CFO, who gave him instructions to send what was approximately 25 million US in a wire transfer. And what's interesting about that is, well, what's more interesting about that in particular is, yes, humans are, of course, the weak link. There's some jokes about that. I'll get to that in a second. But a couple of years ago, I did a study of all of the situations where monetary exfiltration occurred. Fancy way of saying that money was stolen. The reason I mention that is because sometimes they're after data. They're after information, other things. So there's other types of exfiltration that can occur. But in this particular case, we looked at 2 years of all the cases that we worked out with money exfiltration. I wrote a blog. You can find it. It's called 2 Key Security Policies Every Organization Should Implement. It's up on didoweb.com. And the key point that came out of it was policy number 1 was very simple. Ban the purchase or reimbursement of gift cards unless approved in person by the requester. This is one of the number 1 ways that they get money out of companies is with gift cards. And what really made it stop is if we told companies, you're not going to get reimbursed for it. So if anybody asks you to buy a gift card, it's just a no. And that made it more personal for them. The second one we did was we added a verify all ACH or direct deposit changes with a secure form and calling the vendor employee, out of band is what we would use in a fancy term. That means in a method different than the way you were contacted. If you were emailed, you would call a number you know. If you were text messages, et cetera, Google Meet. I mean, a $25 million transfer should not occur without a decent amount of paperwork and verification and sign-offs. So that is just what we would call a failure of principle of least privilege, or oversight, where there should have been more than one person involved in approving that type of transfer. And those type of techniques are so, but those two policies would stop every single type of exfiltration that we saw for money, and it would have applied in this place. If they had used out-of-band communications to approve that money transfer, the person would have very quickly said no. I did not approve that. And
Yeah, because I'm thinking back, there was a case probably a couple of years back. There was a gentleman out of Eastern Europe. I think it was somewhere in the Baltic republics. He was sending invoices from legit manufacturers of components for Google and Apple and Microsoft and technology companies. I don't remember exactly the full range of them. The invoices looked on proper insignia and everything. One small difference, the amounts were big, like millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars. And accounts payables, I'm sure if you're at Google or Microsoft, hundreds of millions of dollars go through just because the organization is so large. So for them to send a wire of that magnitude, and they do it every multiple times a day. So for them, it was nothing out of the ordinary. The only difference was that the email was sent from a similar sounding domain. And obviously the bank details were pointing to accounts that he controlled, not chip manufacturers in Southeast Asia. I think he got arrested. I'm not sure if they recovered all of it, but what you're saying, calling out of band, would most definitely prevent something like this.
Yeah, I mean, that's what we call a close cousin attack, that type of forgery, that type of scam. Many scams that I talk about, when I teach about confidence scams, which is what the term con artist comes from, date back hundreds, if not thousands of years. Like one of my favorite stories about spam, for example, is can you guess when the first electronic spam was sent?
Well, I'm sure probably when the email first came on the scene.
Older.
I don't know which one.
So generally, depending on one definition of what your definition of spam is, the first one was sent by a dentist trying to get work either in New York or Florida. And the second one was sent in bulk about property in New York or Florida. And both of those were sent by telegraph during the Civil War in the United States, which was 1861 to 1865.
So it's a few years before email.
And things like the Nigerian prince scam, Nigerian prince is trying to get rid of gold. That has existed for much longer than those kind of concepts. And usually they would just change it to some exotic place that people didn't know a whole lot about, and they would fall for the scam. But, some of the other ones, are newer. One of my examples that I like to bring up is, for example, I know English is a second language for you, but like a common idiom about people trying to make a joke or pull a fast one is, oh yeah, what are you going to do next? Sell me a bridge. And Brooklyn Bridge, yes. So that comes from a real scam.
Yeah, no, I'm aware.
Yeah, they would print up stock certificates and they would say like, hey, the Brooklyn Bridge or this bridge is going to change to a toll bridge. But if you become a stockholder, you're not going to have to pay the toll. And they would do very standard con artist scams. Like, for example, they would have a mark, that's the person they're trying to scam. And then they would have another colleague. And, they would come up to the person and they would have 5 stock certificates left. And the guy would say, oh, this sounds amazing. I want to buy 4 of them. And this is a colleague of theirs would buy 4 of them. Now the person only has 1 left. And
feeding frenzy, FOMO,
fear of missing out. Exactly. And so this is where you start to see these techniques used in sales techniques, like car salesmen, for example. Oh, I've got 3 other people looking at this car. You got to make a decision by 6 p.m. So almost all confidence scams, there are very few exceptions, but almost all of them, their main goal is to separate your logic from your emotion And they do that in most cases by trying to put arbitrary deadlines into you that make you make a decision. And the number one thing that I hear during incident responses when I'm going and interviewing the people about what occurred, a very common phrase, very slight differentiations, is 10 seconds after I did it, I knew I shouldn't have. You know, usually once the feeding frenzy, that FOMO frenzy, as you were mentioning, clears up, they're like, oh my God, what did I just do? You know, kind of thing. So,
well, people act on emotion, and I'm fascinated by persuasion, how people make decisions, and how other people use words. And it's not just scamming. It's like I had to convince my spouse to be with me and not with someone else. I have to convince kids to eat healthy and keep their grades up. So it's this using words, using communication to get another human being to do something that most likely in their interest. Is just fascinating topic, of which a subset is using that for evil. But I think it's a very fascinating subject, probably for the next discussion. As we
yes.
Kevin, as we coming up on time, I think it's very interesting that our conversation took us down the route of not so much technology, like the new shiny penny and the new tool, whether it's AI or whatnot, but really how everything new is kind of old if you're curious enough to go far back enough. As organizations kind of dealing with a lot of issues, a lot of executives are dealing with stress. They're dealing with doing more with less. We need to be as secure with half the budget, and they cannot deploy all the tools they want. And sometimes they don't talk to the tools, don't talk to each other, they don't interoperate. We're dealing with formidable threats, whether it's North Korea or China or Russia, what have you, now with all the different conflicts that are going on. But going back to the human aspect of it, just based on the courses that you teach, what would be kind of the punchline, 3 things CISOs, VP, director level executives can do in fairly short order to not necessarily upgrade the user, but what would be your advice to them on what they should focus on to not have humans as the the weakest link and make them the first line of defense, if you think about it?
Well, I think the first thing is to build a culture of cybersecurity at your firm. Make people proud of the cybersecurity that you're doing at your firm, and that everybody is part of the solution, not just the problem. That's number one. Number two is they need to look at the problems that have occurred. You know, normally I tell people, like, for example, what issues have you had the last 1 year, 2 year, and 5 year? Solve those problems. Don't try and solve the 100-year, things. Don't try and look at, oh, somebody could deep fake something and trick you into 25 million. Yes, that's a real problem, but statistically, it's very, very minor. So look at what you can do right now, today, in the 1, 2, and 5 year, what has occurred and how are you going to stop that? The third one is kind of an interesting one that a lot of C-suites struggle with, but understand that most general employees are terrified of talking to their boss or a C-suite type of situation. And you need to figure out how you can open those lines of communications. The reason I mention that, and that's my third point, but the reason I mention that is because if you look at some scams, for example, that occur, one of the reasons they occur is, hi, this is insert name of CEO. I'm at a conference. I can't take a phone call right now. I need you to go do XYZ right now, immediately. And people fall for that because they've turned off their emotion they've turned up their emotion. They turned down their logic. They're terrified of disappointing their boss. They're scared of their boss, and they just go and do it. And then their boss is like, why did you do this? And a lot of bosses don't know this. So I had a company that was a furniture company. They were taken for 3 checks. They used a similar technique to what you were talking about before. I won't go into the exact details, but they were able to inject a false bank account into the payment system. And the CFO of that company literally picked up on it and called the CEO of the company. and said, I think these payments are fishy. The CEO, who was later fired, literally said, do your expletive job, etc., and basically shut down. And this is a CFO to a CEO. This is C-suite to C-suite. And they paid 3 checks. And it wasn't until the 3rd check and the vendor called and said, hey, you're like $1 million behind on your payments. They're like, no, we're not. We've been paying them. We got your email that you sent, etc. That was the fraudulent one and that kind of stuff. But in that particular case, the new CEO asked me how they could raise that transparency. And I said, well, they have
talking to each other.
well, the thing also is they had thousands and thousands of employees, and you can't have necessarily a CEO who can accept phone calls from many thousands of employees. I mean, they just don't have the bandwidth. They don't have the time. So in that particular case, you've got to listen to your CFO for God's sake. But we actually had them print up fraud stickers or fraud question mark stickers. And literally throughout the order and the fulfillment process at this manufacturing furniture company, any single person was empowered to stick one of those stickers on the paperwork. And it didn't have anybody's name on it, didn't have any, like you weren't going to get in trouble for it. There was really no, I mean, just everybody had the same stickers, so we wouldn't even know. But that when it finally came, the choice to actually ship that product out, and if it had an orange fraud sticker, it went to people that would be more vigilant about making sure it was going to the right place, doing those out of band things, maybe talking to the vendor, figuring out what's going on.
It's kind of similar to maybe not apples to apples analogy, but back in the day in Japan, a line worker can pull the cord and stop the entire line if he or she like he was backed up in a particular station, so that the entire line would stop until this issue was resolved.
Yeah.
So it's almost similar.
It's actually identical. So the concept you're talking about, I think, is called Kaizen. It's the constant improvement, but it comes from an older thing, which is GE, General Electric. They were trying to lower the error rate during manufacturing to such a insignificant mathematical error rate that basically it was an errorless manufacturing. That's a term called Six Sigma. And so they wanted to get down to a 6 Sigma for the error rate. That's where the leadership concepts of 6 Sigma come from. They come from GE. And it's funny that in those particular cases, they were taught to overseas and they came back to us.
The story that I heard, that the system in Japan, the gentleman who came up with us actually was riding a bus, and there was a line that was hanging that he can pull to let the driver know that the stop is requested. That's how he came up with this, that you can pull the cord and stop the system. So probably there was some osmosis and with G and Six Sigma, but
and it goes back. It's all the rebuilding of the Japanese manufacturing economy after World War II. But it is relative that you mentioned it, regardless of the origins going back further. That was the model. We used the Six Sigma or the Kaizen or the bus stop. That is the model that we designed the stickers when we came up with that solution, was that anybody could pull the brakes.
And subsequent to that, did they catch other instances that looked fishy?
Absolutely, yeah.
Interesting.
It's been a roaring success in that particular company.
Amazing. Kevin, you're such an interesting speaker. I think I can spend a couple more hours, but
My pleasure. Always happy to.
Respect your time, and maybe if you're up for this, I'll be very interested in kind of scheduling another session. But where
just give me some lead time so I can make up some other stuff. I mean, it's hard to create all these stories on the fly.
Kevin, where can people find you? What's where would you like us to send them?
Well, you can find me on LinkedIn. I'm under LinkedIn LinkedIn.com/en or in, excuse me, slash K McGrail, KMCGRAIL. You will find a not photoshopped can of off-brand Canadian spam. That is my initials, KAM, which is my preferred sobriquet. So most people call me Cam and whatnot. So you'll know you found the right profile there. That's a great way to reach me. And happy to chat with almost anybody, give you an email address, talk about things, etc., and move the cyber needle forward. Been volunteering with the Apache Software Foundation and the SpamAssassin project and giving away threat data for decades and decades. So it isn't all just about money. I do like to feed my kids and put them through college. So also happy to talk work, but let's move the cybersecurity needle and do so whether there's money involved or not.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Cam.
My pleasure.
If you liked this episode, please subscribe to this channel and visit Afinia.com for more information about your complimentary membership, or click the link in the show notes.